exciting meeting. I'm very happy to be after Olia and before Jean. This is like a dream actually to be part of, and then to be introduced by Marcell. Following that introduction, I will also tell you that I'm a bit nervous. The way I'm presenting this is actually using tools that are predating the websites that Olia was showing, because I'm looking for ways to show, when I talk about certain issues, I would like to use the tools that go with them. So I'm using Unix tools that date back to the end of the 80s. I use image viewers, I use all kinds of ways to produce this presentation. So, for example, these slides don't exist before I make them happen. That also means, which I haven't figured out, is that there is no way back. So this is the Russian roulette of this presentation. If I make a mistake, I have to start again. So the title of this presentation is "We Don't Live in That Kind of World." So the story I'm about to tell is a story of a succession of messy entanglements between corporate patronage and faltering local governments. It's also happening next door to where I live in the southern region of Belgium. So I live in Brussels. The short of it is how a band of nepotist politicians squandered the archives of a culturally significant utopian, sold them out to a global mega corporation, and then now are throwing a big party to celebrate the public failure as investing in your future. Of course, there's many more things to say, but so you know already how it will end. I've watched this slow-motion tragedy for over almost 10 years now, but it dates back earlier, with astonishment and increasing frustration and anger. It started by simply archiving the stream of newsletters, press releases, pictures, and nice videos, and some of them I will show to you tonight, so you can share some of my frustrations. With the help of friends in Mons, so south of Belgium, in Brussels and elsewhere, we've been trying to think about what this means and trying to find different angles of tech. So tonight I will try again, in a different way. So although this story is set in the murky social and political landscape of post-industrial Wallonia, only 30 minutes away by train from where I live, you will probably recognize many of the ingredients from your own context, and some of them have been talked about today and yesterday and over lunch and breakfast. Otherwise said, none of these events are exceptional in and of themselves. They are not surprising, which is part of what makes me so angry. So that lack of, let's say, outrage is, I think, strategic and exactly the trouble. So, let's start. A would-be cosmopolitan capital in Europe at the turn of the 19th century. The capital is flourishing since most of the colonial revenues end up here in one way or another. Scientists, business people, political activists, and artists travel from all over the world to discuss new ideas at the numerous international organizations that are being established at that time. In the nearby region, miners strike and poverty rules. So this story starts with the utopian, Paul Klee. Someone that was born into that world where he started to think about a system that could represent the multiple networked relations between objects of various formats with various objectives. So he's really a child of his time. Baudelaire, the utopian, invented the universal decimal classification system, a system that he designed because he wanted to map multiple relations between multimedia objects. So, because he's living in a time where photography starts to, newspapers start to be more available, he is really aware that to index the knowledge of the world, you can't stop with books. You have to include other types of materials. So he was interested in postage stamps, postcards, posters, etc., etc. And not only that, he was also interested in how these relations could be mutable, how they could be transformed over time, not only over time, but also through new relations that they would start with other objects. So here you see some of his drawings. The last one was also a drawing of how he saw the relation of the system to the world. Here you see how, for example, books would be indexed in his system. And then he thought up this very complicated multi-dimensional system of classification that would allow you to not put things in only one category, but explicitly asked you to put them in multiple categories. So what you see over there is the notation of a specific object indexed according to the universal decimal system. In that sense, it has a different spirit than the Dewey decimal classification system that was being developed exactly at the same time, or just a bit earlier, in the United States, with a very different story. The Dewey decimal system is still in use. The universal system is, by Baudelaire, is more or less forgotten. And you can both understand that this system is hard to teach and to spread, and also Dewey had a lot of support from businesses because they felt they could use his system in classifying the documents they were handling. So the utopian had this idea of making a system that could make a sort of symbolic universal book of knowledge. And he wrote, "From individual books, collective books are created. Instead of an encyclopedia limited and determined by a certain date, the universal book of knowledge would be an unlimited work, always up to date, always growing, concentrating, absorbing, synthesizing, systematizing every intellectual product from the moment it's born." So, in a way, if you read that, you can understand that the historian Alex Wright, more than a century later, understands this more in the sense of a semantic web of relations than of a, say, strict one-dimensional hierarchical system. So he writes, "It takes a meta-application like Google or Yahoo to discover the broader relationships between documents, usually through some combination of syntax, semantics, and reputation. But those relationships, however sophisticated the algorithm used to determine them, remain largely unexposed to the end user, never becoming an explicit part of the document's history. Baudelaire's vision holds out a tantalizing possibility, marrying the determinism of facets with the relativism of social networks." So this could be another description of the semantic web. So this is another drawing from the Utopian, where he literally envisions this multimedia library in space. So you see a cinema, you see radio, you see a phone, and this idea of calling up the library was really exciting him, and he was literally trying to make that a reality. The other reality is millions and millions of index cards written in this strange cryptic ciphering system that he invented. And at his heyday, he had up to 12 people, women often, working, writing out all these cards. At the same time, clients would be able to call up the library for a fee to get the information they were looking for. So it is a proto-search engine, although the system lying under it, both ideologically and in its structure, is quite different from the search engines that we use today. So, a few years later, it's 1913. Thanks to the tireless support of the statesmen and the patronage of the king, the Mundaneum has become a reality. Housed in the left wing of the magnificent buildings erected for the World Exhibition at Parc Cinquantenaire, the Utopian displays an ever-growing collection of millions of objects, documents and fiches. The Mundaneum receives a steady stream of interested visitors, but very soon the First World War will have to break out. So this is the logo for the Mundaneum, which is the extension of his classification system, is to think this classification system in space. So the Utopian had really this idea that you could make a space on Earth where all types of knowledge would be brought together and where everyone interested in knowledge would come and be able to learn. So this is the wing that he occupied. The building exists. And so when the statesman Henri Lafontaine won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1913, which is tragically just a month before the First World War broke out, he donated half of the prize money to this project. So that is an act of friendship, but also of trust in the project that might look quite strange to us now. So this is the Utopian, some visitors in front of what was then called the Palais Mondial, in a way a forerunner of the Mundaneum. We see him here with his staff and a maquette of what would be in the rooms of the Mundaneum. So on the left you see the layout, and if you look carefully you can see history, Middle Ages, I mean the whole world, both in scale and in time would be there. But you can also see how he was not a scenographer. He collected anything he could get. So he could go from paintings to crafts, to things in vitrines, to actual objects that were in collection. And also, simultaneously, he started to work together with the statesman on a whole range of international organizations, because for both of them it was clear that in the attempt to make knowledge available to everyone and to have peace for the world, international organizations were key. It was important that people would meet to be able to discuss their priorities and problems. So this is one of the many meetings that happened in the Mundaneum. I think, yeah, so this was the International Conference of International Associations, which is kind of nice, which was where the Union of International Associations was sort of started, and this is a sort of proto-United Nations. So that's the type of work he was involved in. But then the First World War breaks out, and Otlet's both sons are sent into the trenches. He loses one of his sons, which means his pacifism gets more, let's say, articulated. He even went out himself to search for the body of his son. So for him, this was a very real environment. At the same time, the interest in the Mundaneum from the government starts to slowly well away. There is a temporary. There's a moment that he temporarily has to move out to host a trade exhibition on rubber, which is the main, let's say, the gold from the Congos. So the government decided that they wanted to have space for that exhibition. And interestingly, the building is now used by a museum called Auto World. So it's the history of cars that has found its place. So it's a very grainy photo. I haven't found the original yet. If you look carefully, you can see Mr. Paul Otlet, our utopian, director of the Palais Mondial, in front of the Mundaneum because he's being evicted, and he physically tries to prevent that from happening. So that is how he ends up with the archive in his own home, just a few streets away. This image is often used to talk about the utopian, and it's kind of sad to know that this is not for nothing that he looks so angry.
Paul Otlet meurt dans la nuit du 10 décembre 1944, à l'âge de 76 ans. Les collections du Mondaneum restent entreposées au parc Léopold jusqu'en 1972, date à laquelle la ville de Bruxelles exige de récupérer ses locaux. Selon la formule d'un de ses responsables, le Mondaneum devient le juif errant de la documentation mondiale. À chaque déménagement, des pans entiers des collections disparaissent. 80 tonnes détruites en 1970, 23 tonnes en 1980, 6 conteneurs en 1993. Et finalement, c'est le sauvetage à Mons en 1996.
So in 1941, Paul Otlet dies. His archives of, let's say, governments and kings have lost interest in his archive, and just a group of friends tries to keep up the Mundaneum in its old glory. So the movie you just saw, apologies for no translation, basically goes through the different locations that the archive was hauled to, wherever they could find a garage or an empty space, and with every move, tons of material were lost. So I think the estimate is that now only 1/3 is still there. And here you see one of the friends of the Mundaneum in the archive. So the archives are stored in the former anatomical theater in the Park Leopold interestingly, in the capital, until in 1975, a scientist working at the University of Chicago rediscovers these archives almost in its original form. And he is the one that published the first biography of the utopian, entitled The Universe of Information, the work of Paul Otlet for documentation and international organization. It's not a title you get a lot of traction with, so...
And I became interested in this man Otlet, and I began to, when I went to the University of Chicago sometime later, I thought I would like to find out much more about him, who he was and what lay behind the universal decimal classification, and I became aware that there was all sorts of questions that one could ask about him, his life, his work, that nobody had ever looked at. And so I came to Brussels to see if I could find any material that would be relevant to answering these questions for my doctoral thesis. And I found the Mundaneum. The Mundaneum as it was at the time Otlet died. It had been moved to the Park Leopold, and one of the rooms was Otlet's office, which had been left undisturbed since he died.
So we fast forward to the 1990s. The former mining region is the home base of the ambitious politician. Since the last coal mines have closed in the 1960s, the region has had the highest unemployment ratio in the country. The Socialist Party, to which the politician obviously belongs, has been in power since time immemorial, but the future of the region does not look brighter so far. So after becoming a senator in 1991, the politician has taken up his first ministerial post as the, let's say, being responsible for the region. Later he will be Minister for Communication and Public Undertakings, Minister for Economy and Telecommunications, and even Foreign Trade. Eventually he has made it into Prime Minister of the country until he had to step down in October of this year. The archives of the Utopian were still in Park Leopold or shortly in a garage in the capital and waiting for a new museum to be opened. The politician saw a chance to make trouble with his colleagues from the same party but in a different area of the country and wrestled out the archive and brought it from the capital to the region where he was king. He asked a scenographist to make a museum for the archive. And in an interview, the scenographist explains the reasons for his design decisions, and he says that he sees, he wanted to evoke the contrast between the archaism of the files by the Utopian and the many network connections that the internet makes possible. So that's the series is about. So this is a reconstruction of one of the machines that the Utopian was dreaming of. And the background is what was left of the file cabinets that he had constructed during his life. Here is a display of that same image with the angry man. And then in 2003, so this was done halfway the 90s, I had moved to Belgium and found out about this strange history and the museum that belonged to it. I had read a blog post by the same historian that talked about the relation between the semantic web and the thinking of Outlet, and also saw a film that was just published at that time, or released at that time. So here I am with early digital photos in the Mundaneum in the region. To our amazement, there was no interface of any kind to disclose the rows of cards, to sketch the historical context and origins of the collection, or even to mention what kind of museum the visitor was entering. No explanation, no guided tour, no catalogue, no legenda, nothing. Apart from the original index on cards, which one is not allowed to touch, we did obviously, inaccessible, and I think I have seen many images of people that have done the same, because there was no guard. So. An accessible database of the collection does not exist and has never been developed any further than a dummy page on Mundaneum's website. The Munda Web computer space in the building is nothing more than a cyber cafe. So what I realized is that since the archive had moved there, basically nothing had happened. It would just be frozen after the scenography was done. So now we're 2005. The industrial site is strategically located. It has access to clean water sources, is located next to the main power grid, and has sufficient access roads. The inhabitants of the region speak the same language as their big neighbor, but politicians here are on the contrary eager to provide those incentives that a mega corporation expects. So here we are. And what do we see? So to our big surprise, now it's been sort of annotated in OpenStreetMap, we found references to a company or organization called Crystal Computing appear in economical reports of the region. The politician had not been so successful in making the region go forward, and he had invented something that was called the Marshall Plan for the region. It was designed to set up, this is literally from the plan, the efforts taken to put the region back on the track to prosperity. The Marshall Plan, ironically named after the American Initiative to Aid Europe, in which the United States gave billions of support to help rebuild European economies after the end of World War II. So it didn't solve any economical problems yet, but suddenly we have this mention of crystal computing. So I translate just that. So in a like a bit of a giggly ambience where all the people involved in the project, the region of the mega corporation, it had remained silent about what was happening for 18 months. The stories about how that was possible did not disappoint. In addition to using a code name, Crystal Computing led the politician one day to put questions about the possible arrival of a crystal factory in Wallonia. He said, "I used every trick in the book I could imagine." Because they understood well that because of the confidentiality agreement binding Google and the other organizations involved, they had to be careful to not make trouble with the big investor. So there we have it, the building of a data center right in the same region where the archive of the Utopian had been moved to. Very uplifting landscape. The politician convinces the king to descend to the region to come inspect what future he is building. So there we are. The data center at this point is not finished, so they can only look at, let's say, banners and logos. Yeah, you laugh.
Well.
So then finally, in 2010, the mega corporation is ready to hold an open day. They've had 5 million euros in tax deduction because they would create more than 140 jobs. But with the Creative Wallonia action plan in place, the government is interested in transforming the area, and so the arrival of the mega corporation comes right in time. And of course, at the Community Day, as it was called, the politician is the guest of honor. So what's interesting to see is that at that time he was still king of the region and not of the country. So there's no official footage, so bear with me, maybe I need some help. So this is just a little part from a long speech, but just hope it brings it.
Messieurs, voilà un peu mon sentiment. Et je voudrais le lire vraiment du fond du cœur à mes amis de gauche. Au début de cette aventure, il y a de cela à peu près 5 ans, on n'osait pas trop y croire. Et oui, on s'est rendu compte que nous avions des conditions. Et en fait, non seulement votre installation ici est une aventure humaine, mais c'est aussi le triomphe de la volonté et de l'optimisme sur le défaitisme. Rien n'est facile. Mais grâce à votre désir de vous implanter quelque part dans le nord de l'Europe, et vous n'avez pas que ce seul endroit, en tout cas sur le continent, nous sommes ici, et il y avait aussi cette opportunité que nous offrait l'Union européenne, que nous offrait la région wallonne, ce désir régional de s'en sortir. Alors, il fallait du terrain, il fallait de l'eau, il fallait du soutien, il fallait de la main-d'œuvre, il fallait ceci, il fallait cela. Vous y êtes arrivés. Et en vous installant ici, non seulement vous avez trouvé les conditions, vous pouvez vous déployer, et j'ai lu pas mal de rapports faisant état de la qualité des entrepreneurs qui ont travaillé pour vous, faisant état aussi qu'à l'intérieur de la maison, il y a un certain nombre d'emplois et des emplois de gens issus aussi de cette région, avec notamment via le forum. J'ouvre une parenthèse, mais je ne peux résister car je suis comme Oscar Wilde, je résiste à tout sous la tentation. Vous savez, il n'y a pas si longtemps, et il y en a toujours, certains critiquaient tout. Et critiquaient entre autres ce canal, ça va de la gare de Mons à d'autres installations. Et ils ont critiqué notamment vous-même en disant « Mais vous savez, il n'y a pas d'emploi, c'est pas des gens d'ici. » Moi j'ai dit, à mon avis, à mon temps. Et aujourd'hui, preuve en est, c'est qu'il y en a. Et donc je voudrais dire aux grincheux gens qui passent leur vie à critiquer qu'il faut saluer celles et ceux qui entreprennent et qui avancent. Par ailleurs, les effets dérivés de l'installation des Google sont énormes, et je ne vais pas entrer dans le débat. Mais alors, peut-être le plus important, nous avons fait ce que nous avons pu, le ministre-président l'a rappelé, le bourgmestre a fait son travail, le collège. Chacun de nous avons fait ce que nous avons pu faire, mais vous n'imaginez pas, vous responsables de Google, ce que vous nous avez apporté. Le fait de nous installer ici a été le déclencheur de l'écriture d'une nouvelle page de notre histoire. Nous étions fatigués, un peu courbés, car nous avons connu des épreuves terribles sur le plan économique, et je ne vais pas entrer dans le détail. Et puis, votre arrivée, ça n'est pas très bien ce qui s'était dit quand le bruit s'est répandu que c'était Google. Tout d'un coup, j'ai vu les torses se redresser. J'ai vu des femmes et des hommes se dire mais si Google vient, quelque chose se produit. Et en effet, ça s'est produit. Qu'est-ce qui s'est produit? Eh bien, d'abord,
2010, sunset over the second data center that has just been completed, and it's only a few years later. The region is still very proud of having the mega corporation in the area, even when only a handful of employees can manage to keep the data center running. The Medak Corporation has started to discreetly support local initiatives, cultural and others, and doesn't organize a party when the second center opens. Also, the Mundaneum has a new director, Mr. Jean-Baptiste. You see him in the middle here, next to the communication manager Europe of the Medak Corporation. His appointment had little to do with his expertise of the work on the Utopian or any of his archives or archives in general, but a lot with his importance for local politics in the region. Obviously, the director belongs to the same party as the politician. Here, so you see him, the official title is Communication and Public Affairs Europe. The manager has become assistant director of the Mundaneum in 2010. She is responsible for managing public and private funds, and that includes the partnership with the Medak Corporation. Her former job was communication at the same Mundaneum. As the manager noted, the historian that we have heard speak earlier is working for an established American newspaper. And he has never disappointed her in underlining the importance and the international importance of the work by the Utopian, but she would never have dreamt of him performing so well. Recently, he made a statement that she could only dream of at the World Science Festival. And he is sitting, the historian, next to the evangelist.
Alex, the radiated library doesn't roll off the tongue quite like the internet, but was he on to the same content?
Yeah, I think you could say that. Yeah, so that was 1934, right? So why has nobody heard of this guy? Well, a couple of reasons for that. One, he was working in Belgium in 1934. We all know what happened in Belgium a few years later. He actually died during World War II, and his work, he actually this was not just theory, he actually tried to build this. He collected an enormous sort of vast index card catalog of about 12 million entries. He was basically trying to catalog all of the published information in the world.
So the internet, is it really being invented in Belgium? She couldn't really care too much because it was a great coup, and it was immediately, of course, picked up in regional, national and international press. So if you look at the website of the Mundaneum, you see it repeat. Google de papier, this was the web time forgot. Un répertoire du savoir universel. So Google on paper is next to statements that are maybe a bit more, give a bit more depth to the work of the Utopian. So she picks up the thread and organizes together with the Medak Corporation as a sponsor, obviously, an exhibition in the Mundaneum called Renaissance 2.0, which celebrates the connections between the work of the Utopian and the internet. And of course, the historian is invited to come and speak.
There's something about the technology industry that sort of discourages historical perception. I think part of that is because it's an industry that's predicated on so-called planned obsolescence. In other words, that we're always being encouraged to think about the next new thing, the new shiny technology that's coming down the pipe. And as a result, I think there's a tendency for us to lose sight of the historical context of where we're now, and to sort of lose our place in history, and understand that we're not living through some necessarily special period where everything is new, all the time. But
I will speed up a bit. So basically, the Mundaneum gets away with it. There's very little critique. There's very little response to this blunt connection between the two. There's one blogger that continuously keeps responding to these kind of connections, and he writes, "To the soiled memory of the utopian by its own mundaneum." Google's Larry Page and Sergey Brin are literally presented as the antithesis of the project developed by Odlet and Henrik Lafontaine. They have absolutely nothing in common. Nothing. Anyway, the first are in the Forbes 500 and gather big fortunes without any originality. They exploit personal data like ExxonMobil or Texaco do with oil. At least the last of these don't hide their intentions. The politician is not too bothered, and this time he makes sure he brings some journalists, so there's glorious pictures. So here we are in the headquarters of the Medak Corporation in 2013. We see the director, we see the politician, and I have not been able to find out who the woman standing next to them is. They're there to celebrate the official collaboration agreement between the Medak Corporation and the Mundaneum. And as the politician has become just recently Prime Minister of the country, of course, he draws a decent crowd. So this is the video that introduces the press conference that has been announced on the Mega Corporation Policy Europe blog as the following. Our partnership with Mundaneum is part of a larger project to revive the memory of Europe's computing pioneers. Europe played a crucial role in the invention of computers and the internet, yet all too often has forgotten its innovators. This is a beautiful story between Google and us, which allows us to recognize the memory of the Mundaneum, says the Mundaneum's director, Jean-Paul Deplus. For Google, it's just as exciting to rediscover its own roots. So, before launching into another lengthy talk, the politician diverts from his pre-written script and makes a quite passionate statement.
Monsieur le directeur, mesdames, messieurs, d'abord, j'ai regardé votre vidéo avec émotion. Pourquoi avec émotion? Parce que Quand j'étais ministre de l'Éducation, c'est moi qui ai sorti des caves les archives du Mundaneum qui étaient stockées et qui pourrissaient quelque part à Bruxelles pour les amener dans ma bonne ville de Mons et essayer de les faire revivre. Et voir comment vous l'avez mise en lumière avec la...
Okay, try to go fast now, because it's not over yet. The mega corporation has created the Cultural Institute and sends teams of engineers to many regions to find interesting content to fill the institute. Our region has refused the mega corporation permission to scan the valuable archives of the Mundaneum, but the manager has made sure that they have access to everything for communication purposes. So this is the Mundaneum on the Cultural Institute, run by Google. It has around 400 high-resolution scans of documents that are indeed in the Mundaneum. There's no structural metadata. There's no way you can download, order, or somehow have access to these files. There's no connections to structural databases at the Mundaneum, so that could be a way to provide a service. There's no explanation why these materials have been scanned and others not. Also, the images can be zoomed in, so very high resolution, but because they've used exactly the same technology as Google Maps, they're all cut up in small squares, so the closer you get, the less information you have. The Cultural Institute is an initiative that has followed from the Google Art project that you might have known. And I just can't resist showing you a little video by the founder of the Google Art project.
Before I get started, I want you to have an open mind to what you're seeing. And for a minute, I try this, it's like therapy. Close your eyes and forget that it's Google doing it. It helps, it really helps. Just don't think about Google. Don't think about all the stereotypes you have about Google, just think of it as culture and art. And then let's talk about why Google is doing it.
My name is Steve Crossan, and I run an organisation called the Google Cultural Institute, and this is its logo, which proves that it's a real thing. And it sounds like the Google Cultural Institute is a very fancy thing, some big lovely place somewhere. Actually, we're in Paris, which is quite but it's not at all fancy. It's got a fancy name, but it's not a very fancy thing at all. Really, it's just an engineering group. So we're an engineering group at Google. You've seen those before. They produce things like Google Books and Google Maps, and we're one of those. What we do is we produce products for the cultural sector. Essentially products and services for the cultural sector. That's the work that we do. And we've been in existence.
I will not spend too much time. There's, of course, digitization efforts by the Mundaneum itself, with beautiful metadata, very little files, and also no access. So, this is something that is not strange to the Mundaneum, it happens everywhere. Just one of the quotes that actually became the title of this presentation from the Chief Information Officer at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel. And he says, people need to remember that Yad Vashem's mission statement is not about technology, he said. Maybe in a world where there was money for everything, you wouldn't need money from people like the mega corporation. But we don't live in that kind of world. So what we did is we asked the chief archivist of the Mundaneum how she was dealing with it, because we knew that the region had refused to give permission. So here's her answer.
Alors en fait, par rapport à Google, Google est un partenaire du Mondaneum, un partenaire privé, mais qui n'intervient pas sur la numérisation. Voilà, tout simplement. Parce que les propriétés des collections, c'est la communauté française. Et vous ne faites rien par rapport aux collections, par rapport à la numérisation, sans en informer le propriétaire. Les propriétaires n'étaient pas d'accord. Donc il y a une image effectivement qui circule, apparemment une grosse association, une grosse réduction dans les esprits qui est mise en place et de se dire, bah, tiens, Google plus Mondaneum, il y a beaucoup de moyens pour la numérisation. Eh bien non, c'est une idée fausse. Et donc quand Google intervient, il intervient surtout par rapport à des contenus liés à la diffusion du web ou alors simplement par rapport à l'idée historique des origines du web, tout simplement. Donc, par exemple, on a vu quelques personnalités, mais c'est plutôt pour essayer de... On fait que de la publicité, effectivement, c'est de la mauvaise publicité quand on pense qu'ils font de la numérisation. Donc la numérisation, chez nous, c'est un gros capital au niveau de la possibilité, enfin, des possibilités de numérisation, mais c'est très peu. Donc un film de la terre. Voilà, donc la numérisation.
Newsflash. The evangelist will visit the region. The director and the manager, having close collaboration with the politicians, meticulously prepared the event. Everything is ready for the arrival of the great American internet pioneer, one of the fathers of the internet. He sold his soul to the Medak corporation, but nobody seems to mind.
Hello, I'm Vince Cerf. I'm Google's chief internet evangelist. I'm looking forward to a visit to Belgium soon. I'll be there to visit our very large data center, which is located in what was once an old coal mining district in Belgium, transforming that economy into a contributor to the 21st century GDP. The second reason I'll be coming to Belgium is to participate with the Mondaneum and the University of Ghent to explore and celebrate old and new ways of organizing information and making it accessible and useful. Something that Google is extremely interested in and has been since its founding 15 years ago. So I look forward to meeting you there and discussing this and other things related to the internet. In the meantime, I'll see you on the net.
Je vous présente Vince Cerf, évangéliste de l'Internet de Google. Vince Cerf. Chris, how are you? Hello, Vince. Hello, Vince. Please, you take that side, okay? Vince Cerf va nous aider à découvrir un peu davantage le Google Glass. Il va faire une petite démonstration. So, take it away, Vince.
So my first problem is I wasn't.
Oui, le premier problème, c'est que je n'obtenais pas la traduction dans mes écouteurs. Mais si vous le souhaitez, je peux vous dire pour vous. Tout d'abord, un grand merci de nous accueillir. C'est absolument merveilleux de me trouver ici. Alors, nous savons également que le centre de données de Google se trouve ici, tout près d'ici. Alors, vous avez vu une vidéo de Google Glass.
So that was his whole presentation, just if you wonder if there was anything else. No, he made Google Glass advertisement. Next scene. A well-equipped conference center in the region. Laptops is the last episode. Laptops with appropriate stickers, keychains, USB discs and tasteful snacks. Just outside are crowded industrial landscapes, carefully cultivated fields and man-made canals. The atmosphere is cheerful, and the visitors from the northern regions feel that they have much in common with their hosts from the southern region. So this was the 1st October this year, when some of us here in the room were working to finish an application at Creative Europe for a cultural project, and we realized that at the same time the mega corporation was applying to support cultural players around their data center from the same funding. And I read from the Google Policy Europe blog how they explain the project. So they start, of course, with saying how different these two regions are, but yet both are homes to Google data centers. And when our Finnish partners recently visited Belgium for 2 days of workshops, they found many things in common. Both regions built their economies on big traditional industries that are fast disappearing: paper and pulp in Finland, coal and steel in Belgium. Both have big neighbors, Russia and France, and both have a willpower to work with us, or for us, to help jump, as our partners put it, from the industrial heartland to the internet age. So I ate. Yes. So this archiving effort to try and understand how Poetlet's radiated library is slowly being turned into the mega corporation on paper, I'm trying to somehow denaturalize the effect, because it seems so obvious and so, let's say, well placed. And by doing that, I'm doing what I can to find space for other types of stories that could have been told in its place. Because when mega corporations, in unison with politicians, directors, managers, and to some degree archivists, scientists, and historians, repeat to each other and to all of us that somehow there is no alternative, but at the same time sell that back to us with the recycled utopian statement, no idea is too great or foolish when it comes to changing the world, I'm wondering whether we cannot settle for the last. Thank you very much.
Questions? Oh, everybody's.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. It was very interesting. And seeing all these projects in this room, I'm really afraid of the future and kind of the procedures of the capitalistic system to appropriate everything. And I wanted to ask all of you how do we go against that and keep these projects alive that are here now and so important for the future of society?
I can give my answer. I think there's only one thing you can do: civil disobedience.
But then, one more question. We have to go on because maybe I would restart with what I came up before. Because also there is an idea in this archive which is now lost in this structure of not being transferred into the next age. When you see the women working there, women became in the scope of being archivists by being first secretarians. And secretarians they became because Remington started after the Civic War in the US to produce typewriters. And these typewriters became because they still need a diktat from a male, becoming the female machine to entering the capitalistic production of the late industrial age. And one of the results is the images we have from this archive of the so-called utopists. is then the utopist, in this case not only fulfilling historically wise, what we also would claim as the position of the Enlightenment to say we have everything, we can collect everything, and we structure the knowledge for you.
Yeah, I think it's hard. No, because I mean, let's say Otlet was close to feminism. I have called him a feminist just out of want. I don't think he was. I don't think that's the big problem we see here. I'm angry because I see that the archive is much more complicated than it gets presented here, because it becomes the genius invention of the one Belgian that luckily is dead and he can't protest anymore. But what is interesting from the scraps of information we get is that there's much more stories going on, and not all of them I'm a fan of, or would like to have people look at more closely. What I find frustrating is that that even in the small gestures, because means are limited. We once calculated that with the surplus money that the mega corporation has laying aside, they can pay everyone that's under poverty level in Belgium 1 year medium salary. You know, that kind of, we're talking that kind of silly, let's say, imbalances. So it's clear that public organizations are underfunded and that they have a hard time to keep up with what audiences are expecting or not seeing. But I think it's silly when they start to play that game and not with the little that they have do generous gestures. So I can get as mad at the mega corporation as I can get mad at like a small, relatively small project of scanning these documents that has the right click disactivated. You know, I find that as frustrating as these balloons. So.
I hadn't gotten advice, only 2 questions, and I took 1, so I give a third, but it's the last.
Love to see the bigger picture of this. You're out. Looks like just to get a bigger picture. You're the only person in the world that's mad about this. There's more than you. Then, second question, what are the activities? You just gave us a description of the situation. You didn't say a thing of what you're doing. Number 3, is there anything like a position of Paul Leclerc in the general, educational space in Belgium at least, like in curricula or at least in technical schools? And number 4, come on, it's like the last field. I'll let you do it with these.
I try to answer all. Yeah. So yes, of course, there's many more mad people. So there's people in Finland, there's people in Chicago, there's people in San Francisco, there's people, and that's why I hesitate a bit between the specifics of this story, as you hear in how I tell it, for this special place on Earth, and the fact that it's everywhere. So it's both specific and everywhere, and that makes it very hard to respond to. So we're trying to bring together people that are mad enough to do something on a global scale. On local scale, we're trying to speak to, well, at least what I have in reach, design, arts, and technology students to have other stories to tell. Because in curricula in Belgium, there's very little about this figure. And so it's quite clear when I show the first biographist and the one, Alex Wright, who just published, let's say, a popular historical account of this work, are both working in the United States, so are not from the region. So it's the it's a difficult terrain to operate on many levels. And also don't underestimate. This area has trouble, and it's the most colorful thing that has happened in a bit of time. So that also makes it hard to go against this story locally. So we have to go on different levels. In the context of this public library project, we have with Robert Oxelman downloaded all image files from the Cultural Institute. So I have the material if you're interested. It's easy. It's there. So if you want to play with it, come to me and I'll give you the material. So that's another thing. And then next year, one episode I've not even talked about will be the cultural capital of Mons, which of course is sponsored by the Medak Corporation. And so that will be a year that we will try to do as much action as we can. So yes, it's a small group, but we do what we can.
Be aware of the fact 1 year after the cultural capital, the debt of the region will be higher.
It's already bankrupt, the festival, so.
So thank you again.
Yes.